There are growing calls for a waiving of COVID vaccine patents to increase deliveries to developing countries. But would it speed up production of the jab? The US thinks it will. The EU believes easing export rules would speed up supplies.
You can give the IP to labs that don't know how to produce it. They won't produce it overnight.
The figures are telling. 30% of people in rich nations have had at least one shot. In low-income countries, it's just 0.35%.
I think I would go one step further and say not just that the world is at risk of vaccine apartheid, the world is in vaccine apartheid.
I'm Ben Fazul and welcome. As leaders around the world attempt to draw lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, one question remains notably unresolved: how to handle vaccine patents. At present, it's only these companies and a select few they have licensing agreements with that are allowed to make the jabs. It's a fundamental principle of intellectual property law, but one critics say is costing lives and slowing down efforts to end the pandemic. South Africa and India have led calls to see patents waived. More than 100 countries, including the United States, agree. Germany is a notable exception, with the government coming out strongly against the proposal. So what are the arguments for and against? Proponents say suspending would help economies reopen sooner. It would also save lives and point to the exceptional circumstances of the pandemic and the fact that pharma companies have benefited from state help. That's our taxpayer money, of course. Those against say it would hamper innovation, slow future responses to future pandemics. They also argue that waivers wouldn't solve production capacity issues and point out that some pharma companies are already selling their vaccines to poorer countries at cost price. So is there a resolution to all this in sight? I'm joined by Elizabeth Masuta. She's an advocacy official with Doctors Without Borders, and also by Sandy Douglas. He's a research group leader at Jenner Institute at the University of Oxford. Welcome to both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
Elizabeth, if we can start with you, we got this vaccine in record time. Would that have been possible without patents?
I would say yes, it would have been possible because the vaccines have not yet been protected by the patents in the past year. It takes about 18 months for this protection to start. And we saw that it wouldn't have been possible without the massive amount of public funding that has actually gone into these vaccines. So yes, we say this could have been possible, and therefore it should be a global public good because of all the public funding that has gone into these vaccines.
We'll get to the funding in a moment. Sandy, what do you think? Aren't patents the tool that drives innovation?
I think in the case of our vaccine developed at the University of Oxford, I agree with Elizabeth. It would have been possible to develop this without patents, although it may have been hard to bring on board AstraZeneca or another pharmaceutical company partner if they didn't see a future in the product where they had some protection.
What about all that state money, though, that Elizabeth mentioned? Shouldn't the state then have a say in how this is all dealt with?
Yes, absolutely. And it's normal at the moment when vaccines are being developed, if they're funded by governments or funded by not-for-profits like the Gates Foundation or CEPI, which the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Initiatives, all of these organizations will attach conditions to funding, which in many cases will prioritize access for low and middle income countries. So in the case of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the UK government had a very active say in what terms it was licensed to AstraZeneca under, and that was not just about protecting the UK interest, there was also a consideration of protecting access for low and middle income countries in that process.
Elizabeth, why is economic giant Germany so against waiving patents?
Well, as mentioned before, there are a lot of vaccine producers and pharmaceutical companies in Germany who have the interest of protecting their IP rights. So their patents, for example, and BioNTech and CureVac, for example, are two mRNA producers which have interest in patenting this. But I would say the strings attached to the public money that, for example, Germany has also invested in BioNTech, for example, or the US that invested nearly $1 billion in Moderna for the R&D in these vaccines, they were not enough strings attached to these vaccines. We want to see effective conditions for affordability, access, and also tech transfer attached to these fundings, because also in the case of CEPI that Sandy mentioned just now, they were not strong enough conditions attached so that CEPI could actually say there needs to be a tech transfer now from the different entities that actually received their funding. So we would want in the future that this would be kept in mind.
We're obviously talking about exceptional circumstances here, but Sandy, let me check in with you. If these patents were waived, would it not be setting a dangerous precedent for how all of this works in the development of life-saving drugs and drugs in general?
Well, I think there's a really complicated, long-term, somewhat ideological debate about that, and Elizabeth and I might take different sides on that. But I think there's quite a different question, which is much more immediate and practical, which is about what can be done now in the situation that we're in now to get as much vaccine as possible to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And personally, I don't think patents are the problem there. Elizabeth mentioned Moderna. Now, Moderna said in October last year that they wouldn't enforce their patents, but that hasn't made any difference to availability of a Moderna-like product in low and middle income countries.
I don't think Elizabeth agrees on that one.
No, because it's not, for vaccine, it's not only enough. I would agree, patents are not the only barrier, especially in the short term, but they are one of the barriers. And for vaccines, we need the waiving of patents together with technology transfer. And when Moderna says as a single company they won't enforce their IP, that is not the same as the legal security that a global patent waiver would have. So that firstly. And secondly, if Moderna is being serious about making their technology and patents available, they would also do a technology transfer to low and middle income countries. We haven't seen this in the pandemic thus far, and that's why we're saying this is not, this does not go enough. But I would agree that patents are not the only barrier that there is.
Sandy, what else did you want to say there?
I think it's absolutely right to focus on the technology transfer here. And having been involved in the out-licensing of the University of Oxford vaccine and the discussion about how we do that, one of the things that's really, really tricky is to think about how you force a company to transfer technology really quickly, because it's a lot of hard work. It comes at the expense of other things that company might be doing. And it's how do you force a company to answer an email today rather than in the morning, for example? It's things like that that make it move quickly. It's quite easy to say you will technology transfer, but it's really hard to make it happen very efficiently and very fast. I think also it's important to think about whether transferring technology to low and middle income country manufacturers is the best way to increase supply of a particular vaccine on a case-by-case basis. I think for some vaccines it probably is, and for others perhaps it's not.
Elizabeth, how much hope do you have with the US getting behind this initiative?
It's an historic move, and it shows that IP is it's been recognized as a barrier to the scale-up. So we need the patent waiving, we need the technology transfer, and all technologies, especially also mRNA, should be taken into account, because we need to end this pandemic. We need to have more vaccines available for more people to save lives and get out of this more quickly.
Elizabeth Masuta from Doctors Without Borders and Sandy Douglas from the Jenner Institute. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And here's our science correspondent, Derek Williams, answering your questions on the coronavirus.
People keep saying we don't know about possible long-term effects of vaccines, which just sounds like soft vaccine skepticism. What are your views?
I think it's almost impossible to have a fruitful conversation about this topic, because when someone says, yeah, but how do you know there won't be problems down the road? Then that's sort of destined to turn into a pointless discussion, as is really any discussion that requires predicting the future 100%. The problem is, in life and in the pandemic, we always have to make decisions about the future based on data that we've collected in the past. We have to choose our next moves based on what that data appears to tell us. It's not a perfect infallible system by any means, but it's the best one we have when it comes to decisions like whether or not to get vaccinated. So here's what the current data says about vaccines in general and COVID vaccines in particular. Both the CDC and the WHO emphasize that the chances that vaccines could cause long-term health problems are extremely low because past experience with many different candidates for a wide range of diseases overwhelmingly shows that when side effects do crop up, and they do, they nearly always do so within a few days or weeks of vaccination. The biggest vaccine drive in history, though, began many months ago, and hundreds of millions of COVID-19 doses have since been administered worldwide. The rollouts are being tracked with an eagle eye. Authorities have detected a few possible serious vaccine side effects in some very rare cases, but nothing that indicates any wider trends. On the other hand, we have an absolute mountain of data on the potentially devastating long-term side effects that getting COVID-19 can cause. Being able to prevent them effectively is a huge advantage. So with the evidence saying the advantage so massively outweighs any known risk, why wouldn't I want to get vaccinated? I don't have to predict the future to choose that. The data says it just makes sense.